It's Hollywood or history, unravel what they portray. Let's investigate, teaching truth, one frame at a time.
Welcome to the Hollywood or History Podcast, a podcast to help social studies teachers and teacher educators use film effectively in their classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Scott Roberts, and in each episode, we talk with a volume editor and lesson plan developer to determine the accuracy of their favorite films.
Hollywood or history, unravel what they portray. Let's investigate, teaching truth, one frame at a time.
What we're going to talk about today is I am going to give you a brief introduction about who I am. We're going to talk a little bit about the pros and cons of using film in the classroom. And then I'm going to spend the bulk of the podcast talking about the Hollywood or history strategy and going over the 9 steps it takes to teach this type of lesson effectively. So to get going, my name is Dr. Scott Roberts. I earned my PhD from the University of Georgia in social studies education. Currently, I am a professor of education here at Central Michigan University, where I primarily teach elementary social studies methods and master level research methods. I am the program director of the Masters in Curriculum and Instruction, and you can find the list of these programs I'm director of in the show notes. I'm a former 8th grade social studies teacher and the social studies program specialist for Gwinnett County Public Schools. I am on the board of the Michigan Council for the Social Studies, and I am the author, editor of a variety of publications about teaching social studies effectively. Now we're going to talk about the pros and cons of using film in the social studies classroom. So just like every educational tool, strategy, method, there's certainly going to be some good points about using film in your classes and also definitely some cons. So let's talk a little bit about those before we dive into the actual strategy. So some of the pros for using film is one, it includes a unique capacity to help students visualize events and concepts. The next pro is it develops personal connections to characters and events. When you're a kid and you're seeing these historical figures on screen, you certainly have the ability to develop those personal connections that you wouldn't get if you were certainly reading about these people in a textbook. Watching film helps you sharpen your analytical and interpretive skills, is a way to understand controversial issues, and finally is a thorough investigation of a subject area content. So definitely we should use film in the classroom. The whole Hollywood history strategy is based on the pros or the ideas that film can be an effective teaching method. Now, definitely with cons. So what are some of the cons of using film in the social studies classroom? Well, definitely lack of student engagement. Like, for example, I loved the movie Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, but guess what? It's in black and white. And I'm not sure if today's students can watch the whole film and really enjoy it with that whole element of the movie being not in color. Obviously, there could be a lot of potential controversies with film. Film shows violent acts. They definitely show things that some kids at certain age levels should not see. So you definitely want to make sure you're careful when it comes to the films that you select. Obviously, you have proprietary issues and availability. With YouTube, that makes things just a little bit easier for us. But you still, that YouTube clip that you're using today may not be there tomorrow. So definitely keep that in mind. Number one con about films. If you show an entire movie like, let's say, Saving Private Ryan, it's hours and hours and hours. You only have so much time in your classroom to teach all of the state mandated standards. And if you do decide to use a film, you need to keep in mind that time is of the essence. So we certainly recommend not showing the entire film when you use this strategy. There are definitely inaccuracies or biases about the topics being portrayed, and even though that's a con, that is the framework of the Hollywood or history strategy. We want students to be able to use primary and secondary sources to determine if that film clip is inaccurate. So this con of it being inaccurate is actually kind of a good thing and works well with this strategy. And finally, when you view a film, it often limits students' opportunities to develop an informed understanding of a topic under study if they do not do a practice like Hollywood or history. If you just basically pop in the movie, press play, give your kids a worksheet with 20 questions about the movie, they are certainly not gaining the understanding that we want them to when we use a strategy like Hollywood or history. So you definitely need to have a purpose and a reason for showing this film, not to just give yourself a chance to, take a day off or, for the sub when you're sick. So definitely use films in an appropriate manner. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the Hollywood or history strategy. So I am a child of the 90s. I grew up in what I consider to be the golden age of Hollywood when movies like Pulp Fiction, Forrest Gump, Schindler's List were all coming out at the same time. And because of my love of history and film, I wanted to develop a strategy that accentuated the positives of using film as a way for students to learn content by examining multiple sources to determine how accurate the film is. So today we're going to talk a little bit more about the strategy. And like I said, I'm going to provide you with a step-by-step discussion based on the Hollywood history framework using all traditional social studies tools. There are 10 volumes in the Hollywood history series with many more to come. And I do want to point out that the initial 10 volumes were published by Information Age Publishing out of North Carolina. However, recently, Emerald Publishing out of the UK purchased Information Age. So all of the books now are under the control of Emerald Publishing, and you can find the information about the books on their websites. But all these books that we talk about can be purchased anywhere you can buy books, including Amazon, Walmart, etc. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Is let's talk a little bit more about how I came up with the strategy. So for the rest of the episode, we will discuss the steps for developing a Hollywood history lesson plan, and I will use examples from 3 lesson plans I created that are not part of the Hollywood history series to illustrate each step. But before I get to do that, I want to talk a little bit about how I came up with the strategy. So when I was an undergraduate student at the University of Georgia in the 90s, the History Channel, before they started showing Ancient Aliens and Pawn Stars and reruns of CSI, used to actually have documentaries about, history. And one of my favorite ones was called History versus Hollywood. So what they would do is they would basically show a movie like Tombstone, and they would show 15 minutes of the movie. Then they would cut to a panel of historians to let the audience know how accurate that section of the film was. I thought it was an amazing series, and you can probably still find some of those old episodes on YouTube if you're interested. But because I was learning how to teach at the time, I was thinking to myself, even as an undergraduate, how could I let my students do the same thing that these historians were doing? In other words, could I get my students to watch a film clip and use a variety of sources to determine how accurate they think the film was, just like the historians were telling us on the show? And I had that idea in the back of my mind for many, many years. When I started teaching 8th grade in the American South in Georgia, in the school I started teaching at, they had this tradition of showing, because it was in the standards, Gone with the Wind. And they would show the entire 4-hour movie. And they would give the students a big packet of questions that the students had to answer as they were watching the film. And I did not think that was the most effective way to use that movie. Now, Gone with the Wind is problematic in many ways, and we can talk about that in future episodes. But I thought that we should do this and use a different approach. And again, this History versus Hollywood show came into my mind. When I became department chair of the 8th grade social studies department, I made sure to stop using the 50-page questions for Gone with the Wind and really wanted to just analyze one clip about Sherman's attack on the city of Atlanta. And I wanted my students to see if that clip was accurate or not. And that was the first time I was able to actually bring Hollywood history into the classroom. Luckily, my teachers I was working with loved it, and the students really seemed to enjoy the exercise of reading a primary source, a secondary source, and comparing that to the film. Once I was successful with that, I began to share Hollywood history ideas with my school district. When I became the social studies program specialist of the school district, I really had the opportunity to share this idea with my teachers I was working with, grades K through 12. And then from there, I was able to do several state presentations about Hollywood history. And then when I became a professor, I wrote a few articles about the strategy that were published in various journals, and it just kind of grew from there. So before I knew it, I did the first volume of the series about American history. That was very successful. And then that has led to this book series that this whole podcast will be about. After this episode, I will definitely have guests where we have the editor of a volume in the book series talking about why they chose their topic and talking more about their selections. And then we'll have a lesson plan author come on as well and talk about their lesson in the same step-by-step process, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how do you actually develop a Hollywood or history lesson. So obviously, in our current political climate, when deciding to use any lessons in the book series or developing your own, it's super, super important that you use your local, state, and national standards as a starting point. Um, I tell my undergraduate students, if it's in the standards, then you can teach it. If it's not in the standards, then you may not want to dive into that topic. So again, when you are developing your own lesson plan, especially from this first podcast, definitely make sure that you keep those local, state, national standards in mind. All lesson plans in the book series are based on state and national standards that were approved when the books were published. So let's talk a little bit about how you select these standards. So some standards lend themselves to analysis and inquiry better than others. I usually tell my students that if you see a term in the standards like identify, that's a very low level type standards. Basically, you can give them a worksheet like, identify the regions of Michigan. Just throw them a worksheet, have them identify those regions of Michigan, and then move on to something a little bit more deeper and more important. When you see terms like analyze, evaluate, that kind of thing in your standards, those are the standards where you say, hey, I want to do inquiry based activities. And Hollywood or history is a great inquiry based activity that you can use when you see terms like evaluate, analyze in those standards. In addition, some films lend themselves better to this type of analysis than others. So, you're thinking about your famous historical movies, Saving Private Ryan. Yeah, certainly there's probably some standards about World War II that you have to teach. Gettysburg, there's certainly standards about the Civil War that you may have to teach. So when you're thinking about what films to use, combine those with your standards and go from there. Like I said earlier in the podcast, use clips. Do not use the entire movie. The great thing about YouTube is you have millions of clips from millions of films that last 5 to 10 minutes. That's not going to take the entire class period, but still allow your students to use primary source, secondary sources to analyze these films. And again, your time is limited as a teacher, like I said earlier. You need to make sure that when you do use films, you use them effectively. And the best way to do that is to use short clips from these films. Don't try to show the entire movie. So once you choose the standards first, then locate a film that match up to the standards, and you should be set to go. Do keep in mind that ratings, availability, and historical accuracy are something you should consider. Obviously, if you are teaching fifth graders, you cannot show the film The Patriot when you're talking about the American Revolution. However, there's another movie about the American Revolution made by Disney, G-rated, from the 1950s, called Johnny Tremaine, which, honestly, some of the battle scenes are more accurate, especially when it comes to Lexington and Concord, than some of those battle scenes that you saw in The Patriot. So if you really want your kids to understand tactics and battles from the American Revolution, Johnny Tremaine would be a better bet for a variety of reasons, even at the secondary level. So definitely, when you're coming up with the idea, keep state standards in mind, pick the right film, and make sure that those films are appropriate for your students. In the past, I have written and presented about different films and standards for the 8th grade level, the 11th grade level, and the 5th grade level, with the theme of the Civil War or the Civil War era, including movies Gettysburg when I was teaching 8th graders, Gone with the Wind for 11th graders, and the famous miniseries Roots when you're talking about when you're working with 5th graders. Again, prior to the past few years, the Common Core standards were the English language arts set of standards that would bring in literacy to these type of lessons. So prior lessons, we really looked at Common Core standards. However, Common Core has gone by the wayside. There's still elements of Common Core in most state standards. But for the most part, I wouldn't worry too much about Common Core these days because, again, they're kind of no longer in existence. But you do want to look at your state content standards. So when I did the Gettysburg lesson for 8th graders, I looked at the Georgia 8th grade standards, and Gettysburg was specifically in the standards, which to me gave me permission to use this Hollywood or history strategy for that film. When it came to Gone with the Wind, I also used the Georgia 11th grade standards, and the Battle of Atlanta was mentioned in the 11th grade standards, thus letting me use the film Gone with the Wind for this Hollywood or history activity. And then finally, for Roots, I looked at the Michigan 5th grade standards, and they discussed triangular trade. They discussed the life of enslaved Africans and free Africans in the American colonies. And they also want you to describe how Africans living in North America drew upon their African past. So again, with these standards in tow, I certainly felt comfortable using the film Roots for fifth grade. And then again, when I went to YouTube, I certainly found useful clips from the movies. So Chamberlain's Charge for Gettysburg, The Fleeing of Atlanta for Gone with the Wind, and then Roots 1977. There was a depiction of a slave auction, and then there was a depiction of Kunta Kinte fight against his captors by letting them know what his name was, not the name that they gave him. So again, all these clips are powerful, and they can certainly be used as the primary focus of the Hollywood or history strategy for each of these films. So after you pick the movie and you pick the state standards, then you want to develop an interesting question. When you're using an inquiry-based lesson, you have compelling questions and you have supporting questions. And these questions are what students should be invited to answer. With Hollywood or history, the question is already there. Students need to evaluate if the film clip is an accurate account of history, pure fiction, or somewhere in between. So your students get to decide using evidence where they think the film falls in this continuum. So 100% history means everything about this movie is accurate. It's like you went back in time and they're seeing how the actual event was. If you say the film is 100% Hollywood, it means everything about that movie is inaccurate. Nothing is true. It might as well be a work of fiction. Or is it somewhere in between? Now, when you look at the primary and secondary sources when watching a film, most students realize that there is elements of truth to these films if they're based on actual events, but there's certainly a lot of artistic license that the director may, or the screenwriter may show as well. So again, this ability for them to use evidence to come up with a number on this continuum is the question that your students are going to answer at the end of all of these lessons. You can develop more specific questions based on the film you're showing. I normally have my students, quote unquote, think like a historian. And when they're watching the film clips and they're reading the primary and secondary sources, I use questions like who, what, when, where, why, and how. And those are the basic questions that a historian will ask when they're doing some historical research. So your compelling question, Hollywood history, how accurate is this film? Your supporting questions are based on the film you're showing. But again, you can always fall back on who, what, when, where, why, and how. So once you have decided on your questions that your students are going to answer, then you want to select your sources. You have to help your students decide how accurate films are, and you should use multiple sources to help your students analyze this. Now, I always say that you should have at least one primary and one secondary source. All of the editors and authors that we're going to talk with over the series will also talk about the sources that they selected when it comes to this analysis. One thing I always recommend, you don't have to, but if you're looking for a secondary source, you always have the state-mandated textbook. That gives you usually a small, short narrative about the topic under study, and certainly in today's time, these textbooks always match up to the state standards. So again, if you're looking for an easy secondary source that's already in your curriculum, the textbook often serves as that secondary source. Primary sources, obviously, may be a bit more difficult to find, but local history centers, the Library of Congress, the National Archives, other curriculum out there for social studies, teaching history and social studies, you definitely have the ability to find useful primary sources for your students. And again, it doesn't have to be textbook and a letter. There are examples of other sources that you can use: documentaries, children's literatures, photographs, maps, charts and graphs, letters, diaries, political cartoons, all can be used as a source. And again, you don't have to use only two sources. You can certainly include more sources based on the ability level of your students. So again, when I am thinking about the 8th grade Gettysburg lesson, I found a couple of primary sources. You have excerpts from Chamberlain's book called Through Blood and Fire at Gettysburg. And then you also have Confederate General wrote a book about Gettysburg as well, Oates, and it's called The War Between the Union and the Confederacy. And again, Oates' book talks about his perspective during the Battle of Gettysburg. The secondary sources that I chose include the textbook account about the Battle of Gettysburg. You have Shelby's Foot, the Civil War narrative, and then there's several others. And even if you wanted to use historical fiction about the battle, Shera's The Killer Angels is about the Battle of Gettysburg, and you can certainly use excerpts from that as well. When it comes to Gone with the Wind, there is a really important letter when it comes to understanding the Battle of Atlanta. General Sherman wrote a letter to the mayor of Atlanta at the time, basically letting him know that he has X number of days to get the civilians out of the city before he starts attacking it. So unlike the movie, not to bury the lead, but unlike the movie that looks like that it was an overnight attack, they didn't know it was coming. The citizens of Atlanta knew for a while that the city was going to be destroyed, but Sherman did give them some time to leave. And this letter that he wrote to the mayor of Atlanta explains that in great detail. Obviously, for the secondary source, textbook accounts of the Battle of Atlanta, an excerpt from Trudeau's Southern Storm, Sherman's March to the Sea, and then again, because the movie Gone with the Wind is based on a work of fiction, historical fiction, you can certainly use excerpts from Mitchell's Gone with the Wind as well. Finally, with Roots, there is a great interview from the 1920s and 30s with a former person who was enslaved, Fountain Hughes, talking about his experience when he was enslaved. That would be a primary source I would use for Roots, and then a textbook account of slavery in the United States, slave stories from a website from a museum in Liverpool, and then again, with that historical fiction element, work from Haley's Roots. Now, the last thing I'm going to say about using a primary source is definitely some primary sources are not easy for our students to read. They're written in language from the time period that may make it more difficult for students to understand. So what Sam Weinberg, who is a professor at Stanford University, has recommended is he says it's okay to change the language of a primary source or the reading level of a primary source to meet your students' needs, as long as the original document is somehow attached to that revised document, that still makes it a primary source. So for those who work with elementary school students and you're looking at a letter from 1776, you're like, how are my kids going to read this? Well, you can basically put that into a program that adapts the language for your students' reading ability, but do attach that original source with it, and you're still using a primary source, but your students are able to read the document with their reading ability. So next step in Hollywood history is to develop a graphic organizer, and in order to help your students organize their thoughts, they should be provided with an organizer. The great thing about the book series is every lesson in the book series has an organizer attached that was developed by the author of the lesson plan. In our Hollywood history volumes, the organizers have the following categories. You have a box where students are able to analyze the movie clip. Then you have a box where students are able to analyze the secondary source. You have a third box where students are able to analyze the primary source. And then at the bottom of the page, there's a box where students are able to respond to the question, Hollywood or history, how accurate do you think this movie clip is? So you may like the organizers that you see in the book, or you may want to create your own, which is perfectly fine. But definitely when you do a Hollywood history lesson, have that organizer to help students organize their information. Okay, finally, step 5. After coming up with the standards, coming up with the film, organizer, questions, sources, then you actually get to show the movie to your kids. I always say when you do the lesson to show the movie first. Let the students see the movie. They may think a movie day is a day for them to not have anything to do. And little do they know, they're going to be working hard and thinking hard when you actually, after you show that film. But again, it brings in student buy-in when you show the film clip first. So like I said, you show the film in your organizer. You have your students watch the film and they jot down the who, what, when, where, why, and how of the what they saw in the movie. Let your students know, and I always ask my students this as well, say, can you answer all of these questions just by looking at one source? And hopefully you've done enough inquiry lessons in your classroom where they realize the answer is no. That's why we use multiple sources. One source is not going to give you all the information or an understanding of the perspective of those who are involved in this event. So that's why you want to use multiple sources. So again, you show the film, they watch it, they write down who, what, when, where, why, how to the best of their ability. If you are able to, I would include the closed captioning that YouTube often provides, and I would also show the movie twice. The first run, they can watch it, then I'll show the clip again so they can write down the who, what, when, where, why, and how. Then, after they've written down their answers, always, always, always let students work with a partner, because you want them to work collaboratively to make sure that they both have an understanding of what the film clip was about. So again, always have that partner element when you show the film. And then again, this really does allow your students to have that buy-in. They know they're watching a movie, and then they're about to become a quote-unquote junior historian, mini historian, whatever you want to call them, to get them pumped about really diving into the analysis piece of the lesson. Okay, so I say after you show the film, then you let them read the secondary source. Again, secondary source is something that was not developed during the time period, and students will get a chance to read a more, I don't know, usually modern perspective of that event that's being shown in the film. So again, have them read the textbook or the secondary account with a partner, have them answer the who, what, when, where, why, how about the secondary source, and then have the students compare and contrast what the secondary account was about compared to the film. So what was similar between the movie and the secondary source, what was different, et cetera, et cetera. So again, you're really starting the analysis piece. They've watched the film. They're thinking about the who, what, where, when, why, how. You give them that next source. They read that source. They work together with a partner, and they have to determine, based on the two sources they've looked at, the movie and the textbook, what's similar and what's different. Then after you do the textbook or the secondary source, then it's time to dive into that primary source. And I tell students after they've watched the movie, after they've read that secondary account, I just ask them, are you ready to hear what people who lived through this event have to say about it? And they're like, we can do that? I'm like, yeah. And, they're not going to tell you, but they certainly describe it in their writings, their journals, the newspaper clip, whatever you decide to use. So again, that's when you bring in the primary source, really saying that you can understand this topic through the eyes of someone who was involved. And again, tell them that a primary source was obviously something written during the time period. Secondary source, generally something written after the time period. But again, it really gives the students an understanding of the person or event based on an eyewitness account. And after your students go through the same process, they read the primary source independently, they work with a partner, they answer the who, what, when, where, why, how. Then they compare the similarities and differences between the primary and secondary sources as well as the film. Okay, then after you have done this analysis, again, some lessons are very simple. One film clip, one primary source, one secondary source, you're ready to move on to step 8. Other lessons in the book series, it's much more detailed. Many more sources are used. But again, it's up to you as the teacher to decide how many sources you want to use based on the time you have and your students' ability level. But once you get to through the analysis piece, then we move on to step 8, the actual Hollywood history. Students have been able to analyze a film clip, a primary source, secondary source, compare and contrast with a partner. Now it's time for them to make a judgment about whether or not they think the movie shows an accurate depiction of the topic under study. It should be very clear, for the most part, now there's obviously exceptions, that there is usually no right or wrong answer as long as students are able to cite evidence to back up their claims. So a student may say, I think this movie is 75% Hollywood, 25% history, meaning 75% of the film clip is absolutely fake, 25% there's elements of what actually happened or truth with a lowercase t. But as long as they're able to back up that 75-25 claim with evidence from their sources, that's fine. When you start doing this with your students initially, some of them will be like 50-50, or most of them will be 50-50 because it's easier for a 5th grader or 8th grader or 11th grader to just make that stance. But even if they're 50-50, they still need to cite evidence to back up their claim. And again, the length and the nature of the response of their Hollywood history judgment is based on the teacher. I generally say 2 or 3 paragraphs, but again, it depends on your time, your students' writing ability, etc., and of course the age level. So definitely kind of keep that in mind. Then, after your students have had a chance to individually discuss how accurate they think the film is by using evidence to support their ideas, then we have to do some sort of conclusion. In the C3 framework, the NCSS C3 framework, that final step is called taking action. Your students have to do something with what they learned. If you want to do something inside the 4 walls of the classroom, one approach I like to use is called the line of contention. So what you do is on your whiteboard, you draw just a line. One end is 100% Hollywood, one end is 100% history, in the middle 50-50. And then you do a 75 on each side as well. And you have small group students come up to the board and stand with their papers in hand where they think the film actually falls on this continuum. All right. Again, a lot of them like to do 50-50, but I've definitely had those, I want to say 87.2% history and whatever the rest of that number is. I'm not a math person, as Hollywood. And again, you get, you have that. And as long as students can support their claims with evidence, let them stand wherever they want. And they do enjoy it. Then you have them basically, a few of them volunteer to say why they're standing where they are and to read their response where they show that they're using evidence to come up with their claim. But there are a number of other concluding activities that can be used as well. And again, the great thing about the book series is every single lesson, the author has decided to do something just a little bit different when it comes to this conclusion piece. So when you actually read the lesson plans in the books, you definitely get a variety of ideas for how to conclude these lessons. Okay, so to conclude, as social studies teachers, you have the opportunity to bring ideas like Hollywood or history to your English language arts colleagues. So I highly recommend, especially when you're doing movies based on historical fiction, like the ones that we talked about, Killer Angels, Roots, and Gone with the Wind, bring in your language arts colleagues and see if y'all can do something with this. Maybe they can work with the secondary sources with your students while you focus on the primary. But I think the English language arts teachers I've worked with have certainly enjoyed this strategy as well. And it's definitely can lead to some cooperation and collaboration with those in a different discipline. Inquiry-based lessons like Hollywood history enable students to develop not only the skills, but a greater understanding of social studies content as described in the C3 framework. And we hope that this activity helps produce active and informed citizens by allowing students to be critical readers and viewers of information from all types of sources. And honestly, the number one reason, according to the National Council for Social Studies, that we teach social studies is to help produce active and informed citizens. And if they're able to do this type of analysis on a movie clip, we're hoping they can do the same analysis on everyday life, like a political campaign ad, using multiple sources to see how accurate that campaign ad is, or buying a car, which is the best car for you, or even going to university as opposed to maybe to trade school. All of these tools they learn from Hollywood history can be helpful, not just becoming a good film critic, but again, with our everyday civic and economic life. Okay, so you will have access to the PowerPoint I've been using as my guide for the podcast. And I do want to fully admit I am not the only social studies educator who thinks that using film in the classroom is an effective strategy. Many of my colleagues before I got into the business, if you will, and currently have discussed the effective use of film in many, many different ways. So when you look at the PowerPoint that's going to be in the show notes, I do have a list of other interesting articles and books that you may want to look at if you want to use film in your classroom. But I will give credit where credit's due. Alan Marcus, Jeremy Stoddard, Scott Metzger, Will Russell. A lot of these folks were writing about using film before I really started getting into it. And definitely they were are folks that I looked up to when it came into the development of this strategy. So I have written a series of Hollywood history lessons outside the book series. Some are easy to find if you look at my page on Google Scholar or LinkedIn. But you can certainly, especially if you're in graduate school or university, you can find these in your local library. But on the slide that you'll have access to, I have all of the articles I've written outside the book series when it comes to Hollywood history as mostly free guides to help you out when it comes to developing your own lessons. I've also been fortunate enough recently to be in additional media where I was able to talk more about Hollywood history and the use of film in the classroom. Central Michigan University also has another podcast called The Search Bar, and I provide the link to my episode on the slides in the show notes. They also had a promo where I basically let viewers know in 30 seconds or maybe a minute how accurate our favorite films are. So you can definitely watch that. That has like over 5,000 views now, so maybe you've already seen it. And then finally, I was on WCMU Radio and their series about local events in the community, where I was able to have a short interview talking about the Hollywood history strategy, where I talk a lot about the most recent Bob Dylan movie and how inaccurate that may be. Okay, so I do want to take some time to plug a few additional things going on with me as far as my work when it comes to Hollywood history. One, I actually have a new book coming out through the National Council for the Social Studies. It's called the C3 Framework in Film, bringing Hollywood to the social studies classroom as a catalyst in teaching inquiry. That will be out soon. I literally got the proofs in yesterday. So by the time you hear this podcast, it will be on the verge of being published, if not already published. And you can certainly find that book on the NCSS website and then eventually any local library, hopefully. I am also doing a Hollywood history workshop at the Social Science Education Consortium called Hollywood History and Inquiry-Based Strategy for Using Film to Teach About Historical Renewal, where we will be discussing the film Detroit and talking about the 1960s riots in the city, how accurately that's displayed in that film. My presentation day and time has not been set, but the conference is June 17th through 21st, and I am doing a workshop, so I think we really would like classroom teachers to attend conference. So if you live in Detroit or nearby areas, please feel free to take a look at the Social Science Educational Consortium's website to learn more about this conference and definitely consider coming out to my session. Finally, I also have a new article coming out that I wrote with several colleagues in social studies and English language arts about the use of Hollywood film to help students understand contemporary societal ideas and values when it comes to watching film. And so what we did was we used 3 different Great Gatsby films as the focus for this lesson. So basically, even though The Great Gatsby is based in the 1920s, do you see 1940s values in the 1940s version of the film? Do you see 1970s values in the 1970s version of the film? And do you see, I don't know, aughts or 2010 values when you watch the 2013 movie with Leo and Tobey Maguire? So again, this article will be out in the History Teacher Journal soon. And again, it may be out by the time you hear this podcast. So thank you very much for hanging with me today. Again, for the rest of the series, I will have probably way more entertaining guests talking about their own work. But again, we just want to give you a understanding of what this strategy is and how you can make your own lessons when it comes to using Hollywood or history. Until next time, we'll talk to you soon. Hollywood History volumes are now published by Emerald Publishing out of the UK. All volumes can be purchased on Emerald's website or anywhere books are sold. If the innovative ideas discussed in the podcast have led you or a family member to consider earning an undergraduate or graduate degree in education from Central Michigan University, we encourage you to review the links in the show notes or contact host Dr. Scott Roberts at rober4s@cmich.edu. We offer undergraduate degrees in general and special education at the elementary level, secondary disciplines including social studies, and graduate degrees in curriculum and instruction, instructional technology, literacy, health and PE, and special education. We also have accelerated teacher certification programs for those with undergraduate degrees in something other than education who want to become excellent teachers in the state of Michigan.